Ohio is rich in folklore and is the home of thousands of haunted locations. This is a compilation of terrifying tales from my home state. In downtown Columbus, one of the oldest bars in Ohio is the home of a dark evil that terrorizes the employees and serves as a reminder of the gruesome tale of the murder on Mound Street. The Jury Room is a bar that was built in 1831 across from the Franklin County Courthouse, and it was a popular gathering place for judges, attorneys, and politicians. It served many purposes through history, being used as a restaurant, hotel, stagecoach stop, and even a brothel. But even before the bar was established, the earth on which it was erected had already been desecrated. The Jury Room was built on Mound Street, which was named after the burial mounds built by the prehistoric Adena and Hopewell Native American tribes. The mound that was near Mound Street was said to be 40 feet tall and was used as a source of clay for bricks in the construction of various buildings throughout Columbus. The destruction of the mound began around 1830, but by 1888, the mound was completely destroyed. In 1888, in regards to the destruction of the mound, a local journalist said, "One of the most pretentious mounds of the county was that which formerly occupied the crowning point of the highland on the eastern side of the Scioto River on the southeast corner of Mound and High Streets in Columbus. Not a trace of this work is left. When the first settlers came, it was regarded as a wonder, yet it was not spared. The expansion of the city demanded its demolition, and therefore this grand relic of Ohio's antiquity was swept away." The clay that was removed from that large, ancient mound was used to build the State House. By the 1950s, the Jury Room had transitioned into a brothel. It was a cold night on March 31st, 1859, when there was a persistent banging at the brothel door. The madam, Frances Miller, was startled, and as she looked out the window, she saw a boisterous posse of slurring men who stood at the door to her brothel. She called out to the men that the brothel was closed as it was well past midnight. The ringleader of this group of drunk men was a man named Paulus Ruprecht. Paulus was a regular at the brothel, and even referred to it as his farm, as he perceived the women as nothing more than his animals. Paulus was determined to get into the brothel, and Frances was afraid. She feared for her life and the lives of the other women she worked with. She grabbed her pistol, and as she swung the door open to confront the belligerent men, Paulus tried to force his way into the building. Frances Miller shot him dead, right there in the doorway. The news spread quickly about how a woman of the night slaughtered an innocent man, and she was arrested the next day. A newspaper article was published on April 1st, 1859, stating, "At about 2 o'clock, the officers brought in the murderess, Mrs. Frances Miller. At this juncture, the excitement was intense, everyone wishing to see the woman who had stained her hands with the blood of a fellow creature. She's a woman of about 40 years, of very forbidding aspect, her complexion being dark, high cheekbones with eyes that glare like those of a cat. Her form is gaunt, reaching a height of about 5 feet 6 inches. Her hands are bony with fingers long and skinny which seem to possess the province of holding the murderous pistol." However, when referencing Paulus, this is how he was described. Paulus Ruprecht was a young German, aged some 20 years, a painter by trade, good-looking, well-dressed, and considered respectable. In his intoxication, he was overflowing with good nature, but the poor fellow's persistent lingering about the tiger's den cost him his life. May this be a warning to the youth of this city to avoid and shun as a loathsome pestilence these hells with which our capital abounds. A human life has been sacrificed for the fancied protection of a leprous spot, which infests the whole neighborhood. In the court of public opinion, Frances Miller was already guilty of manslaughter before her trial even began. She spent 11 years in prison for an act of self-defense. Ownership of the bar has changed hands many times throughout its 193 years, but many people who have worked in the Jury Room have claimed to see tall shadow men. Bar stools have flipped over in empty rooms. People have been grabbed, scratched, and choked by invisible entities. Whatever still resides in the shadows of the old bar is angry with the living. Is it the soul of Paulus, whose time on the earth was cut short? Or is it something even darker that was never living in the first place? Whatever it is that resides in the historic bar on Mound Street, it wants revenge. On the Miami University campus in Oxford, Ohio, there was a mysterious disappearance that intersects the worlds of true crime, conspiracy, and the paranormal. This is the terrifying true story of the Phantom of Oxford. Ronald Tamman Jr. was not a typical student at Miami University. He was extremely involved in extracurriculars around the campus. He was a residence hall counselor for freshman students, a wrestler, active in the Delta Tau Delta fraternity, and his pride and joy was playing string bass in the college jazz band. Ronald was often described as kind, handsome, smart, and studious. All of his friends and family, including his 4 siblings, spoke very highly of him. One thing everyone agreed on was that Ron Tamman was not someone who would run away without saying goodbye. But on that snowy night on April 19th, 1953, 19-year-old Ronald Tamman disappeared and was never seen again. The theories regarding his disappearance are extremely varied. Some people think that Ronald was simply overwhelmed by school and had a mental health episode that ended in him dying from exposure to the elements. Others think foul play was at hand, potentially involving fraternity hazing. And some people even speculate that Tamman was recruited by the CIA and involved in MK Ultra.
CIA documents show that the agency was interested in developing mind control methods of its own.
I will not be diving into those theories today, but rather presenting the facts of the case and discussing the bizarre paranormal occurrences that followed this young man's disappearance. On that frigid April night in 1953, Ron had been seen multiple times around campus. He had spent time at his fraternity, and around 7 p.m. he was helping a friend study, only a few dorm rooms down the hall from his own. Sometime before 8 p.m., Tamman returned to his own dorm room to study, which was room 225 in Fisher Hall. Not long after, he was seen getting new sheets because his friend had pranked him by leaving a dead fish in his bed. Mrs. Todd Hunter, the residence hall manager, commented that he looked tired, to which he responded that he was, and he was planning on going right to sleep. Ron's roommate, Chuck Finley, returned to the dorm room around 10:30 p.m. to find it empty. Ron's psychology book was left open on the table, even though he had dropped out of his psychology course earlier in that semester. He had left his wallet, but taken some cash from it. He left his coat and his car keys in the dorm room. His car was found in its typical parking spot with his beloved bass stored in the back seat. Since it was clear that Ron would not be gone for long, having left nearly all of his earthly belongings there, Chuck assumed he was spending the night at the frat house. Ron likely left his dorm room sometime between 9 to 10 p.m. When Ron did not return the next day, Chuck notified the authorities. There was a sighting of Ronald in 7 Mile, which is a community near campus. A woman said there was a knock at her door in the middle of the night, and when she answered, there was a young man who matched the description of the missing youth. She said that he appeared to be very confused and couldn't even remember his own name. He asked her where the nearest bus stop was, and she sent him on his way, but the buses weren't running that night.
My mother said, well, that's the boy that was here at our door. And so we went to Oxford to the police station and talked to them. But I was at the door with my mother also, and I'm positive it was him.
The story spreading through the newspaper about his disappearance was that he was suffering from amnesia. Hundreds of students and ROTC members joined in the search for Ron, but they never found any trace of him. Eventually, the case went cold. In the fall after Tamman's disappearance, things became strange around campus. As I mentioned earlier, Ronald lived in Fisher Hall in dorm room 225. Students in Fisher Hall heard disembodied singing coming from the woods. For 2 nights, the singing persisted from the shadows of the forest. And on the second night, 2 students saw a man with long hair striding into the darkness. On the 3rd night, 2 counselors heard the voice yet again, and this time they chased after it across the golf course. On the 5th night, a figure in a long black coat was chased through the woods and lost in a ravine. Fisher Hall has an interesting history as well. It was originally used as a sanitarium prior to being purchased by Miami University in 1925. By 1957, only 4 years after Ron's disappearance, Fisher Hall transitioned to the theater and drama department. Students began seeing unexplainable shadows and often heard muffled sounds from the condemned areas upstairs, where the dorms used to be. Fisher Hall was demolished in the 1970s, and the Miami University's Markham Hotel was built where it once stood. The disappearance of Ronald Tamman was made even stranger by the lack of progress in the case. It seemed like in decades of searching, almost no leads were gained. Could the bizarre and seemingly paranormal events that followed be related to the case? What do you think happened to Ronald Tamman? A restless spirit haunts Beaver Creek State Park in Columbiana County, Ohio. An engineer named Gil Hans brought his family all the way from Holland in 1836 to help build a portion of the Beaver Canal. The Beaver Canal was built to promote better commerce and transportation, but it ceased operations only 4 years after its completion when a flood caused a breach in one of the dams. Gil's daughter, Gretchen, was terribly homesick and spoke often of wanting to go back to Holland. Tragically, she ended up contracting malaria, and on August 12, 1838, she succumbed to her illness. Her father wanted to fulfill her dying wish by bringing her body back home, but he had a job to finish. As he continued his work on the canal, he built a crypt on one of the locks and temporarily entombed her body there. A few months later, Gil prepared arrangements to travel back to Holland. They loaded up Gretchen's casket and set sail on the Atlantic. But Gretchen and her family never completed the voyage. A storm blew in and sunk the ship, and the bodies of the Hans family were never recovered. Now, the ghostly visage of a young, forlorn girl is still seen roaming along Gretchen's Lock, waiting to return back home. Amidst rolling hills and lush green fields, 2 gutted brick outbuildings are all that remain of an overgrown manor with a sinister secret. Mudhouse Mansion is one of the most haunted houses in Ohio. It was built in the late 1800s by a family that left behind a gory and horrifying legacy, though some say they never truly left. Mudhouse Mansion is an abandoned farmhouse in Fairfield County, Ohio. It has been owned by the Mast family for over 100 years, but the original family that owned it was the Ruff family. It stood empty from the 1940s until 2015, when it was demolished. There are many legends surrounding the Mudhouse Mansion, but it remains shrouded in mystery. It was a rite of passage for local teens to sneak into the abandoned home, and most have felt the dark presence that lurks within. Many people have claimed to hear groans and cries coming from the dark, empty mansion. Legend has it that a family moved in the 1890s, 30 years after it was originally built. The neighbors watched as they moved into their new home, but after unloading the last of their luggage into the house, they weren't seen again. After a few days of silence, a neighbor looked out at the mansion. All she saw was a woman, dressed in white, staring out the window at her. Each day, she looked out at the foreboding mansion, and each day, she saw the woman standing there, staring out the window. But no one ever left the home. After 10 days of watching, the woman decided to call the police. When they arrived, they entered the living room and saw all 5 members of the family hanging from the rafters, dressed in all white. The mother, in her nightgown, was hanging beside the window. Mudhouse Mansion became a liability for the family who purchased it in the early 1900s, and in 2015 they decided to have it demolished, but the outbuildings remain standing, looming over the rolling hills, and many people say that the land remains cursed to this day. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe.